When I pulled up to my Wisconsin cabin on a Friday evening, a little girl I had never seen was drawing with chalk on the front steps. Her parents were unloading groceries from an SUV. The father greeted me cheerfully and explained that he had rented the cabin for his wife's birthday. He had paid my older brother, Rick, $900 for the weekend. The problem was that Rick hadn't owned any part of that cabin for almost 4 years. After our father died, I paid Rick roughly $80,000 for his share. He signed the transfer papers. The deed was recorded in my name alone, and I had covered every tax, repair, and insurance bill since. When I called him, he didn't sound embarrassed. "It's still the family cabin," he said. "I don't need permission every time." I was 50 years old and worked as a construction superintendent. I understood the difference between sentiment and ownership. Memories could belong to a family. A deed could not. I didn't throw the renters out after dark. They had 2 tired children and had done nothing dishonest. I checked their receipt, asked them to send me every message from Rick, and let them finish the weekend. Rick mistook that courtesy for surrender. By Sunday, I had found a laminated welcome sheet. Instructions, warning guests not to speak to the neighbors, and at least 11 unfamiliar families recorded in my father's old guest book. My insurance agent confirmed that Rick had been collecting the money while leaving me exposed to the risk. Then my 2 adult nephews arrived with a truckload of friends and demanded the door code. "Dad still owns half." One of them said, "We don't need permission from you." That was when I understood Rick hadn't merely rented out my cabin. He had rewritten the sale, convinced his own sons to help operate the business, and promised future weekends on property he had already been paid to surrender. Rick believed family history could erase a legal signature. Soon, that signature would be the only version of his story. He couldn't change. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 50 years old then, and I worked as a construction superintendent in Green Bay. Most of my weeks were spent coordinating crews, checking schedules, and solving problems before they became expensive. The cabin, 2 hours north near Eagle River, was where I went when I wanted nobody asking me when the electrician would arrive or why a delivery was late. Our father, Walter, had bought the place when I was 12. It wasn't much then: 2 bedrooms, a sagging porch, and a roof that leaked around the chimney. Dad never had enough money to hire out everything, so the 3 of us grew up holding boards, carrying shingles, and learning that almost level was not level. Rick was 5 years older than me. Our sister Elaine was 3 years younger. After Dad died, the will divided the cabin equally among us. That sounded fair until we had to decide who would pay for the new septic field, the taxes, and the roof that had reached the end of its life. Elaine lived in Arizona and wanted out. Rick's small equipment repair shop was having a rough year, and he needed cash more than another bill. We hired an appraiser, agreed on a value, and I paid each of them roughly $80,000 for their shares. Rick signed the same transfer papers Elaine did. The new deed named me alone. I never declared the cabin off-limits to the family. Elaine called before visiting when she came back to Wisconsin. Rick did too. At first, I had even given him the old keypad code so he could take his boys fishing if the place was free. But permission to visit was not permission to rent it, and nobody in our family could honestly confuse the two. The couple in the driveway introduced themselves as Tom and Heather Bell. Their 2 children were already choosing bunks. Tom's confidence disappeared when I showed him my driver's license and the property tax notice I happened to have in my truck. He pulled up a payment confirmation on his phone. The $900 had gone directly to Rick. The message beneath it promised 3 nights, use of the aluminum fishing boat, and enough firewood for the weekend. I stepped away from the children before calling my brother. Rick answered on the 4th ring. I asked one question: "Why are strangers staying in my cabin?" He paused, then said Tom was a friend of a customer and that the place would have been empty anyway. "He paid you $900. I handled the booking. You don't own it." That was when he gave me the line about it still being the family cabin. He said I was getting stuck on technicalities and that Dad would have hated seeing the place sit unused. I looked through the window at Heather lighting candles on a grocery store cake. "Did you tell them you don't own it? Don't make this awkward for everybody." Dan. He hung up before I did. There was a motel 20 minutes away, with one room left. I told the Bells they could stay through Sunday, under 3 conditions. Nobody used the boat because it wasn't insured for paying guests. They locked up when they left, and they sent me copies of every message and receipt. Tom offered to leave. Heather looked mortified. Neither of them had done anything dishonest, and it was nearly dark. So I told them to finish the birthday weekend they believed they had rented. I drove to the motel with my overnight bag still packed. My hands started shaking only after I turned off the engine. On my phone was an old photograph of Dad and Rick replacing the porch railing. For a few minutes, I wondered whether I was being exactly what Rick said, someone using paperwork to claim a place that had once belonged to all of us. Then I remembered the check I had written him. Memories could belong to a family. A deed could not. On Sunday afternoon, I returned as the Bells were loading their SUV. They had swept the floors and stripped the beds. Tom apologized again and forwarded the full message thread. Rick had used the name North Pine Family Cabin. The check-in instructions included the old keypad code, directions to a spare key under the deck, and a warning, not to mention the rental to neighbors because the township is fussy. That last sentence changed the situation for me. This wasn't casual. It was concealed. Inside, I found a laminated welcome sheet in a kitchen drawer. It explained the fireplace, the garbage schedule, and where guests could find extra towels. None of it was in my handwriting. The guest book Dad had kept for relatives contained recent entries from families I didn't know. One thanked Rick and the boys for a winter snowmobile weekend. Another mentioned an anniversary trip in May. I photographed every page. By the time I finished matching dates to weekends when I had been working or visiting my daughter, I could identify at least 11 separate stays. There may have been more. Rick had been careful to remove the welcome sheet after some of them, but not careful enough to erase what people wrote. On Monday, I called my insurance agent. My homeowner's policy covered invited guests, not an undeclared short-term rental business. If someone had fallen through the dock or been hurt in the boat, I could have faced a serious coverage dispute. The agent advised me in plain language, stop all paid occupancy until I had the right policy, inspection, and local approvals. I had no intention of turning the cabin into a rental, so that decision was easy. The locksmith installed a new deadbolt and replaced the keypad. I removed the spare key under the deck, changed the Wi-Fi password, and put a camera over the driveway. I wasn't trying to spy on family. I needed to know who was entering property for which I carried all the risk. Then I emailed Rick. I attached the recorded deed, the closing statement with his signature, and the payment record from the buyout. I asked for a complete list of past and future bookings, every amount collected, and the names of anyone who had already paid. I gave him until Wednesday evening. His reply arrived in 9 minutes. He said I had bought the financial burden, not the family's right to use the place. He claimed he had spent rental money on mowing, propane, and maintenance. I paid the propane company directly. I mowed most weeks myself, and the neighbor's teenager handled it when I couldn't. Rick had cleaned the gutters once and replaced a torn screen. Those things did not explain 11 weekends of payments. Wednesday passed without a list. The following Friday, the driveway camera alerted me while I was eating dinner at home. Rick's sons, Cody and Mason, had arrived in 2 trucks with 6 friends. Coolers, sleeping bags, and enough fishing gear for a tournament. Cody was 26. Mason was 23. They entered the old code 3 times, then called me. Cody sounded annoyed. Uncle Dan, did you change the lock? Yes. Why didn't you tell us? We've got people here. I asked whether they had checked with me before inviting those people. Dad owns half the place. We don't need to book it through you. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I asked Cody to repeat it. He did. I drove north the next morning and met them at a diner. The friends had gone home, and both nephews looked insulted on their father's behalf. Mason said Rick had explained that I bought Elaine's share after Dad died, while the money I gave him was only an advance against future expenses. According to that version, Rick still owned half, but let me handle taxes because I earned more. I set copies of the deed and closing statement on the table. Cody read the first page twice. Mason went straight to the signature page. Rick's signature was dated, notarized, and sitting beneath a sentence that transferred all his interest in the property to me. He said this was temporary. Mason said. It wasn't. Cody called his father on speaker. Rick answered cheerfully until Cody asked why the deed showed Daniel Mercer as the sole owner. Rick said deeds were for banks and taxes, not for deciding what family meant. Then he accused me of ambushing his sons with legal documents. I said almost nothing. I didn't need to. Cody asked, Dad, do you own any of it or not? Rick would not say no. He kept answering a different question. That was the first time his sons stopped defending him. Mason admitted he had created the cabin's social media page. Rick supplied photographs, prices, and available dates. Cody answered inquiries when his father was busy. They had each received a little money for helping, and both believed they were promoting property. Their father partly owned. Mason opened the booking calendar on his phone. 7 more weekends had deposits attached, including most of deer season and New Year's Eve. The deposits totaled a little over $3,000. Rick had the money. Elaine agreed to host a family meeting at her house when she flew back for a work conference. I chose her kitchen because it was neutral ground, and because no one could claim I had locked them out of a conversation the way I had locked them out of the cabin. Rick arrived 20 minutes late. He didn't apologize. He put Dad's old cabin key on the table as if it were evidence of ownership. Even though it no longer opened anything, I laid out the guest book photographs, the Bell's receipt, the future calendar, and copies of every annual tax bill since the buyout. I asked Rick again for an accounting. He said the rental income had kept the cabin alive. Elaine surprised all of us by pulling up a transfer on her phone. The previous winter, Rick had asked her for $600 toward emergency furnace repairs. He told her that former owners should still contribute because the property would always be a shared family asset. There had been no emergency repair. I had replaced the furnace 2 years earlier. Rick's face changed. He said he had meant roof repairs, then dock repairs, then general expenses. Each explanation arrived only after the previous one failed. Eventually, the truth was less dramatic than his excuses. His repair shop had lost 2 commercial accounts. He had used the first cabin payment to cover payroll during a slow month. The next rental covered insurance on the shop trucks. Once the money began arriving, he treated it as a side income he was entitled to because he was Walter Mercer's oldest son. He told Cody and Mason he still owned half because admitting he had sold it would have meant explaining where the buyout money had gone. I understood the fear beneath that decision. Rick had spent his whole life wanting to look like the man who could carry everyone else. But understanding it did not make me responsible for financing it. Refund the future guests. I said, give me the list, and stop using the cabin's name. Rick leaned back. And if I don't, then my attorney will ask for the accounting. There was no shouting. Elaine stared at the table. Cody looked sick. Mason closed the booking calendar on his phone. The next week, a local attorney sent Rick a formal demand to stop representing himself as an owner or agent. It was not a magical court order. It was a clear written warning backed by the deed and the evidence we already had. The letter requested records and reimbursement, and it told him that any new booking after notice would be much harder to describe as a misunderstanding. The nephews gave me the contact information they had. I called the 7 future guests myself. I told them the bookings were unauthorized, that the property could not host paid guests, and that their refunds had to come from the person who accepted the money. I helped 2 families find other cabins nearby. It cost me nothing but time, and it kept innocent people from arriving with groceries and children the way the Bells had. The hardest call was to a retired couple named Jim and Marlene Foster. They had reserved New Year's Eve for their 40th anniversary, because Marlene had grown up near Eagle River. Rick had already told them that I was merely a difficult co-owner trying to take over the calendar. I had to explain that there was no co-owner and no authorized calendar. Jim went quiet, then asked whether Rick was really my brother. When I said yes, he answered, "That must make this worse for you, but it doesn't make our deposit less real." He was right. I found them a room at a small lakeside inn and sent them the number, but I could not return money I had never received. That belonged to Rick. Those calls took most of an evening. Afterward, I sat at my kitchen table with Dad's handwritten cabin notebook open in front of me. It contained furnace filters, paint colors, and reminders to drain the outside faucet before the first freeze. Dad had treated responsibility as part of ownership. Rick had taken the part that produced cash and left every other part on my table. For the first time, my anger felt cleaner than guilt. Rick did not refund them immediately because most of the money was gone. Instead, he wrote a long message in the family group chat saying I had used my higher income to steal Dad's cabin and was now humiliating him over a few weekends. An aunt told me I should share. A cousin said family property was different from normal property. I replied once. I wrote that Rick had voluntarily sold his entire share, had been paid, and had no authority to collect rent or promise access. I attached the signature page. Then I stopped arguing. For several days. I thought the embarrassment might finally make him cooperate. I was wrong. Mason called me on a Tuesday night. His voice was low and tired. A man had contacted the old page asking about a February ice fishing weekend. Mason told him the cabin was unavailable and shut down the account. Rick contacted the man privately, took a new deposit, and promised he would have the access issue handled before February. Mason forwarded me the messages his father had sent after being confronted. One said, "I need the money for payroll." The next said, "Your uncle will give in once people are standing at the door." The final one told Mason not to mention the deed. That decision ended Rick's ability to call any of this confusion. He had accepted new money after receiving the attorney's letter, and he had put his plan in writing. More importantly, his sons could no longer tell themselves they had misunderstood him. Cody and Mason contacted every person who had booked through them. They created a complete ledger from payment screenshots and old messages. Over 18 months, Rick had collected just under $15,000. Some money had gone toward cleaning and small supplies, but none had paid my taxes, insurance, septic work, roof, or utilities. Most had gone directly into his business account. The ledger also showed how gradually the scheme had grown. The first payment came from one of Cody's co-workers for a quiet fishing weekend. Rick charged only enough to cover what he called cleaning. 3 months later, he was charging holiday rates, adding fees for the boat, and accepting overlapping inquiries in case someone canceled. Seeing it in order mattered. There had been no single desperate mistake. Each successful weekend had made the next lie easier. Mason asked whether I planned to sue him and Cody too. I told him I had not decided anything until I knew who had understood what. Their messages showed that they had repeated false information, but they also showed Rick correcting them whenever they suggested checking dates with me. I did not excuse their carelessness. I simply refused to turn 2 more family members into enemies before the facts required it. One canceled guest disputed his payment. Another threatened to file a fraud complaint. Rick's payment account was restricted while the disputes were reviewed. The income he believed he could keep using disappeared at the same time refunds came due. My attorney and Rick's lawyer eventually worked out a civil settlement. I did not demand every dollar he had ever touched. After documented cleaning costs were deducted, Rick had to refund the outstanding guests, repay Elaine, and reimburse me over time for the unauthorized use and legal expense. To cover the first round of refunds, he sold the base boat. He kept behind his shop. That hurt him, but it was his choice, and it was better than making strangers absorb his loss. The most important page was not the repayment schedule. It was Rick's signed acknowledgement that he held no ownership, management right, rental authority, or continuing claim to the cabin. Any future family visit would happen only with my permission, just as it would at anyone else's home. He signed without looking at me. Cody and Mason apologized separately. I believed they had been lied to, but I also told them they were old enough to verify ownership before collecting money for property. They accepted that. For several months, neither asked to visit. Elaine paid nothing more toward imaginary emergencies. Rick kept his shop. Though he reduced his staff and moved to a smaller building when the lease ended, his repayments arrived unevenly at first, then regularly. We did not return to being close brothers. Sometimes a boundary preserves only what is still possible, not what used to exist. The cabin changed too. I installed a simple sign inside the entry: private family home, no rentals. I kept Dad's photographs on the wall and his dented red thermos above the stove. Owning the place alone did not require erasing anyone who had loved it before me. The following autumn, I invited Elaine for a weekend. Cody and Mason came up for one afternoon, brought firewood, and left before dark without asking for the new code. Rick declined the invitation. I was disappointed, but I did not chase him. On Sunday morning, I sat at the end of the dock with coffee in Dad's old thermos. Mist rested on the lake, and somewhere beyond the reeds, a loon called once and went quiet. There were no strangers in the bedrooms, no unpaid promises in my driveway, and no messages asking me to surrender something simply because saying no made another person uncomfortable. The cabin was still part of our family history. It was also my home, my responsibility, and finally, a place where I could rest again. Would you have kept sharing it after that betrayal? Or changed the locks the moment you learned what your brother had done?